Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. A couple of notes about logistics. One of them is your mic and video, not yours, Laura, but everyone's except yours and mine, are turned off, but do feel free to use the chat and the Q&A. If you have any questions, and Laura, if I look distracted, it's not because I'm not fascinated, it's because I'm trying to read the Q&A because I'm juggling. So, but if you have any specific questions, put them in the Q&A and we will pick them up at the end, if not during. So, and for those of you who would like closed captions for this event, there again, down at the bottom of your screen is a thing that says CC or show captions, and it should be there. The general chat is on the side. The good people who are running this will probably be keeping an eye on it. If you're having a problem, put it in there. If you're just there, feel free to say hello to people on the chat because it won't bother me or Laura because it's not live. So I am Laurie R. King. I am the author of 30-some mysteries, the most recent of which is Back to the Garden, which is a cold case investigation that brings together a powerful California family, a 70s serial killer, and murder on a commune. There you go. But tonight, I am excited. Is it tonight or is it this afternoon? Whatever. For you, it's tonight.
Okay. For me, it's tonight.
For you, it's tonight. So we are tonight. We are where Laura is. Tonight, I am excited to help the San Mateo County Libraries and the NorCal chapter of Mystery Writers of America welcome Laura Lippman. Laura Lippman. Since her debut novel, Baltimore Blues in 1997, Laura has become one of the most distinctive voices in mystery fiction. Stephen King calls her special, even extraordinary. Don't you like being called special? And Gillian Flynn thinks she's a brilliant novelist. Laura is translated all over the world. She's won most of the crime world's prizes. She's a New York Times bestseller and an all-around really nice person. So today we are discussing her newest book, Prom Mom, which has been described as subversive, provocative, and deeply chilling. I agree. And with that, let us begin our conversation with Laura Lippman. Welcome, Laura.
Laurie, thank you so much for doing this. I probably told this to you multiple times, like you're one of my heroes, like you're like one of my gods. So yeah, to me, you're like the role model of what everyone should be doing, which is you can do this and you can do that, and you're just amazing.
I thank you. I loved Prom Mom. I don't know how I would describe it other than subversive, provocative, and deeply chilling. But I wonder, would you mind giving us a bit of a summary or introduction to Prom?
No, I would be happy to give a little bit of an overview. And I know you get this, Laurie, is that you write a book and you're very clear on what's in your head, and then it goes out into the world and you start to get some feedback and you're like, oh, wow, no.
And that so what I wrote?
Yeah, the thing that surprised me is that people would be like, oh, this is based on a real story. This is ripped from the headlines. And I was like, not really. It wasn't ripped from the headline. It was the headline. I wasn't interested in a real story. I wasn't interested. I heard this story on a podcast called You're Wrong About, which featured two different stories about untimely birth of children at dances, and they died. There were, and if you start to just even research a little bit, there are way too many stories of children born to teenage girls in denial, and the babies don't survive. It happens so often. I was in St. Louis this week, and I was with the writer Eileen Dreyer, who is also an emergency room nurse, and she said, we saw 20 cases a month in the ER of women who had no idea they were pregnant. not just teenagers, like across the ages. So what I was interested in was kind of that disconnect with the body, because the host of the podcast, Sarah Marshall, who subsequently became a really good friend, she just made this kind of off the cuff remark and like, oh, of course, teenage girls know their bodies so well. And I was like, yes, that's it. That's what I want to write about, is the idea that it really is completely plausible that a girl could be in denial about this, could be confused enough not to know that this is happening. And then I wanted to write about, and then what happens 20 years later, if that girl, now a woman, returns to her hometown and realizes that she has unfinished business with her date that night, a date who wasn't around because he was off chasing his ex-girlfriend, and like the idea of obsession. And I think that a lot of us are very interested in people who knew us when we were young, because they reflect back to us a version of ourselves that we really like. So it was like all of those things. And so that's Prom Mom to me. It's the story of a woman who, more than 20 years after she gave birth to a baby who died at a prom, did time in juvenile facilities for her crime, ends up back in her hometown and realizes she's still really interested in the guy who took her to the prom that night. And unfortunately for her, he's very happily married to a woman who seems pretty much perfect.
That it can't go well.
No.
Now, to sort of loop back about, Laura and I were talking a little bit earlier before about COVID. I write, as you know, Laura, and some of you out there know, I write mostly historicals. And in the most recent one, I was amused that sections of it being in the 1970s were historical, which you kind of think, hey, I was there. It can't be historical, right? However, I got to say that the COVID pandemic in this one kind of feels historical to me. So tell me, did you have to actually research?
Okay, so it's crazy, but 2019, 2020, and the first 6 months of 2021 feel like a discrete historical era that is so long ago. It feels so far behind us. Now, I started writing this book in early 2021. So I was kind of writing in the time that I was going to attempt to capture, but my first several months of writing, I produced a lot of stuff I had to throw out. You know, that happens. I kept really good journals during COVID. I'm a journal keeper in general, but my journals during COVID, during the hardest parts of COVID, were kind of exceptional in their detail, because I didn't have anything else to do. I'd sit exactly where I'm sitting right now, my dining room table, and it would be like night, and my kid would have gone to bed, and I'd be like, what do I do now? I guess I'll write in my journal about what's going on. And it feels like forever ago. And I think that's kind of the reason I was willing to risk it, because, you know, there is an argument to be made that no one wants to read anything about COVID. No one wants to go back there. But I feel like it feels so far in the past that it was safe for people to come back to it. I feel like I'm looking across a great divide at those months. They were so odd. And
Like closets full of toilet paper and
yeah, oh yeah, I have just finally gotten over my hoarding. I used to have so much toilet paper and paper towels in my basement, and I'm now calming down about that. But I was like, you know, that's over. Just having to figure out what to do with your days. Like, what did you do? Where could you go? We could go for walks and drives and Target. Those are kind of like the options.
And in the early days, I mean, this book straddles from 2019, which is sort of before anyone had even thought of it, to the days when there's the insurrection going on and, you know, so forth and so on that spring. And in the early days, we really didn't have a clue. I mean, before we had Dr. Fauci telling us exactly what to do, nobody wanted to touch anything. I remember going shopping with not only masks, but gardening gloves on, because you couldn't touch anything because it would be absorbed through the skin.
I mean, definitely one thing I drew on for this book is there is a scene from spring of 2021 when a character gets vaccinated. And at the moment the needle enters his arm, his overwhelming experience is, oh my God, I'm not going to die. And that was my experience, which is I tend to be a fairly positive person because I think it's healthier. And so I didn't I had friends who were totally caught up in kind of like the doom of it all. And they were very worried and they were very anxious. And I don't allow myself to be that way because I don't find it to be healthy for me. And at the moment that my first vaccination entered my arm, I almost burst into tears. And I really thought, I'm not going to die. And it was only in that moment that I realized I had spent 18 months worried about dying, which is, you know, just an extraordinary thing for an otherwise healthy person to have been going through the world day by day. Like, am I going to die? Like, I'm not going to die. I'm like, oh my God, I'm not going to die. And again, I just think it was an extraordinary time emotionally.
It's amazing that any of us came out of it with any balance at all in our poor little brains. And
I'm not sure we did.
That's why I said any balance. I mean, some of us have sort of tried to get back on track, but
I mean, I think I'm different. I think I'm balanced, but I am a different person than I was 3 years ago. I'm not the same.
No, nothing will be the same. Other differences that show up in the book. You yourself divide your time between Baltimore and New Orleans, and your characters do too. Not only the main character, but the others have roots in both places. It's interesting how you can. I mean, not only are you playing with the two different kinds of time, that is pre-COVID and during COVID, and then sort of semi-post-COVID. But you're also playing with the personalities of these two cities and how they affect the people who are involved. Can you say a little something about the physical settings and the decisions you made there?
Sure. So the two locations are Baltimore and New Orleans. And Baltimore is my hometown, and I've always felt very comfortable writing about it. And like, no one can come for me when I write about Baltimore. I'm like, yeah, you're not gonna, you can't catch me. I'm gonna get it right. New Orleans is much trickier. I became a part-time resident of New Orleans back in 2009, and I now consider it my second home. And it is a city full of writers, full of people who can't wait to catch you making a mistake. So it's like really fraught to write about New Orleans and you're not from there. And I felt, I think, emboldened because I'm writing through the eyes of someone like me who's from Baltimore and has come there later in life and fallen in love with it. So I'm not trying to write the true New Orleanian version, because the character Amber, who's the girl who had the baby at the prom and ends up in New Orleans, she would have my POV. Like, she would see it through the eyes I see it. But I did write about a character who was a New Orleans native. who has married Joe, the date, so she has that background too. And I felt like I could kind of just get away with that, primarily based on my history at a local gym in New Orleans, where all of the women are like kind of very fancy uptown women. And I studied them like I was Margaret Mead all those years I was in nursing. I was fascinated by them. And I have a very, very good friend, Greg Heron, who lives in New Orleans and writes about it all the time. And I got to the point where I would like just tell Greg things that I'd learned about the uptown ladies that he could use in his books, because I wasn't writing about New Orleans at the time. But yeah, New Orleans is a super tricky city to write about. And I felt like, okay, I think I can just get away with it because the one character, Amber, is seeing it through an outsider's eyes. Those are my eyes. And the native Meredith is the daughter of people who moved there from somewhere else. So she wouldn't be considered she'd be considered a New Orleanian, but she'd be kind of on the bubble. It's a complicated city.
Yeah, the kind of city you really can't say anything rude about it because yeah,
well, I never would say anything rude about it. I love it. I love it so much. I mean, I've held on to my house there, which is just a folly. It's just crazy to have another house in New Orleans. I mean, there was a practical reason for a while, but that reason no longer exists for us to have a house there. And I have, there was a hurricane in 2021 that looked so bad that I sat here. I mean, I literally sat here and I was like, okay, tomorrow morning I might wake up and my house could be gone. And that's okay. That's the bargain. That's what you agree to when you fall in love with New Orleans, is you have to agree to this potential for destruction. And I was lucky. It was only like a couple of branches down and pretty minor damage. But yeah, I love that city like crazy.
And the way that it adds to the flavor of the different characters. I mean, Amber is in Baltimore, she's one, and then when she's in New Orleans, she's the other. I found that you could feel the sort of change in the air when she gets off the plane. The number of things that you play with in this book, trying to narrow it down to a 40-minute conversation. One of the things I enjoyed was you've got a woman and a married couple and another woman. And in the background of the COVID lockdown, which the most of the book takes place during some form of lockdown or another, I felt as if these people were almost on one of those Agatha Christie stories about putting them on an island and inviting them, and you know that bad things are going to happen. How deliberate was this playing with the sort of mystery tropes that you've got?
I mean, we were talking a little bit before we got started, and I had never thought about it within the context that you just proposed, but it actually makes sense. COVID is not a literal locked room, but it did create a different world in which people were kind of closed in. And I mean, on the one hand, it was like, are you crazy? You're having an affair during COVID and your wife is immunocompromised. What are you even thinking? But then on the other hand, it kind of makes sense. The world has gotten smaller. And it's almost sort of like there's a timeout. This isn't real. This isn't, I mean, we've talked, that's the language, right? We talked about getting back to normal. So this wasn't normal. And so therefore, you could do things that you wouldn't normally do. Although, as we find out in the book Prom Mom, Joe has gone to the adultery rodeo more than once. Sorry, he's not a newcomer to that experience, but he's always rationalizing, and he always has a reason for how did he do that thing that he shouldn't be doing. So I really did feel that, I mean, you've articulated it so beautifully. I just had this feeling that it was like an out of time out. We get to behave differently than we normally behave because we have all of these restrictions around what we can do. And it's going to make people a little bit kooky, and it's going to make people inclined to do things that they would. I mean, if you think about it, okay, we did things in a good way that we never thought about doing before. I mean, in general, in the United States, most of us didn't wear masks to go grocery shopping. We didn't worry about touching things. We weren't forever sanitizing. I mean, my hand washing is just never going to go. I mean, I'm washing my hands all the time now. Like, I have a consciousness about my hands and how dirty they are in a way that I didn't have before COVID. So you have that, which are sort of the good things where you're being respectful and thinking about how your habits affect other people. So it seems to me to be logical that then you have like that, yin and yang of, so in one way you're being a better person than you ever were, and maybe in another way you're being a worse person than you ever were.
Yes. Yes. The number of us who had cracked skin on our fingers from the amount of alcohol that we put on our hands. Similar to the mystery tropes, like the locked room island thing. Your 4 characters, and I sort of this sort of has more to do with your writing technique than anything else. Your 4 characters come together in ways that, on the one hand, they're absolutely predictable. I mean, you know that as soon as you see this person and that person, they're going to end up there. And yet you also have ways of twisting that are just wildly unexpected. So how deliberate was that? I mean, how deliberate a writer are you when it comes to things like those sorts of character and plot twists? Again, without giving any spoilers to people, because I'm assuming that not everyone has read it.
Yeah, I think I become more deliberate over the drafts. I write a lot of drafts, and I start off kind of knowing there's one big idea. There's one big idea. I kind of know this one thing. Here are my characters. How will they discover this thing that I know? What will they feel? What will they think? I've talked about this as kind of the distance shore school of plotting. It's like I'm going to cross a river, and I think I know where I'm going, but there are a lot of things outside of my control. So I have to do many, many drafts until I kind of understand it all. And really pay attention to the characters. There is an earlier version of this book in which there were a lot of ancillary voices. It was, in the first draft, it was almost like a true crime podcast, which kind of makes sense because it was inspired by a podcast that, while not dedicated to true crime, was about a true story. And, the true crime story has a lot of witnesses, right? It's like, okay.
All the points of view about what happened.
Right. Like, what did the high school guidance counselor think? And what about the maid who found the crime scene? And what about the coworker at the ice cream store? It's like, and so there were all these outside voices, and I probably wrote more than 100 pages that I ended up throwing out, but I learned a lot from writing them. And ultimately I was like, no, this is a book where 3 people will have a point of view, and there will be a 4th character who's important, but she'll never get a point of view. And it, sometimes, I don't know if it's like this for you, Laurie, I'm I'm somewhat kind of intuitive. It's like I do what I do, and then afterwards I can explain it. So I didn't start with this understanding, but I arrived at the understanding that this is a story about interiority. It's about the three main characters and what goes on in their heads, where they are often cold and unlikable and judgmental or full of rationalizations, because that's who a lot of people are inside of their heads. And I feel like the pandemic kind of brought that out in a lot of us, being a little bit more judgmental, being a little more solipsistic, like, I've got to be for myself now. It's like me against the world. It's what I want and what I need. These are not attractive or pleasant qualities. But I think a lot of people inside their head in 2020 were probably not their best selves. And so I realized that I was writing a book that was very much about what people were like behind, not the mask that we wore here, but the mask that we wear every day, the mask of politeness and civility. And I care about your feelings, and I'm going to observe social mores. And inside our heads, we're just like beasts and barbarians, especially, I think.
Oh, speak for yourself, Laura.
I might just be speaking for myself. I mean, I will happily cop to the fact that I'm definitely a person who, when I go through my day-to-day life, I value my manners, I value my politeness. I like to think I'm very well behaved. And inside my head, I'm a raging beast. And like my 13-year-old kid has been like, Mom, you need to dial back the judgment.
So when did you write the first draft of this, the multi-voice first draft? When were you writing this?
I probably started it about after many false starts, because I would have started the book around January 2021. I think I finally found the groove right around the time of where the book would have been ending. So like that spring of 2021, I found the groove, I found the book. And I think it's actually really relevant that a huge portion of this book was written during Omicron, during that late fall of 2021, the winter of 2022. I was so depressed because I had a little taste of freedom. I left the house. I went to New York. I went to the theater. I went to a friend's surprise birthday party in Providence, Rhode Island. It was like, yes, yes. And I was like, no, you have to go back inside. Yeah. And I found that, that was kind of like my lowest point. I was much more depressed during that time period than I think I was during 2020, because I thought everything was okay and it wasn't. And I think that had a lot to do with how the tone of the book and the way the book reads.
Yeah. It's interesting that you are writing a book with many voices and all of them having a point of view about this case at a time when there was no community. I mean, we didn't have voices. We didn't have people. We had ourselves. And then as soon as we're starting to come out of it and you're narrowing it down, you're shaking all the community voices off at a time when community is opening up again. So I find it interesting, Laura.
It was. I mean, there are a lot of things where you can question a lot of the choices I made in the sense of who wants to read a book that's set during this time. It's a very dark book. These are not likable people. I mean, I'm okay. I'm personally okay reading books not about likable people. I think it's actually significant that the most important writer in my life, in terms of whose I own I own every single book. He takes up an entire shelf in my library, is Philip Roth. And Philip Roth didn't write about likable people. And I don't think Roth was maybe that likable. Through my ex-husband, I had an opportunity to meet Philip Roth, and I was like, no, thank you. No, I'm not going to do that. That's a writer I need to keep on the shelf in my library. I don't wish to meet the human because I don't think it's going to be that great.
Yes. Laura, I'm going to take a few questions from these people. I have some more that we can come back to, but one of the people asks, was the title the amazing title, the one you started with? Did you change titles or?
It's one of the few times that it's the title I started with. I mean, I basically stole it from the podcast, and I was very honest with the people on the podcast, like, hey, I stole your title. And I kept it, and I fought for it. There was some pushback. Some people at my publishing house were like, what is that? I'm like, oh my God, how can you not know what that is?
Yeah, I think really, and Cad Dad is sort of goes to,
that I made up. Cad Dad was my invention.
Yeah, because CAD is not something that most people in this country really use, but it's good. It's got a good rhyme to it. So, anonymous attendee writes, "What is your writing process, and do you write every day?"
I write Monday through Friday in the mornings. The best mornings are the mornings that I'm not responsible for getting my kid to the bus stop, because then I can start really early. And I am a really early riser because I get up to walk at sunrise. So, like in July, I'm getting up around 5 a.m. Now I can push it to 5:30, and pretty soon I can get up at 6 to walk at sunrise. But the best, the easiest mornings are the mornings where I only have myself to take care of. And I get up and I walk, I get a cup of coffee, I come home and I write, and I try to write a minimum of 1,000 words a day, and just kind of spend the morning, ideally like 8 to 11, I'm writing. And then I'm kind of done for the day. I might do writing related activities in the afternoon. I'll do my email. I might, there's all this other stuff, it's like the stuff that I only really like the writing. I put up with all the other stuff because we have to. And I'm very extroverted. I'm not a shy person, but I really, really love the writing. So I try to write every morning, Monday through Friday. And then I get to the point where, like, right now I'm in the middle of a revision. I mean, I have a book that I'm going to finish by the end of the month. And so right now I'm trying to revise 10 to 20 pages a day, and I'm taking copious notes, and I'm, and I'll just keep revising and revising until the end of the month when it's due.
Oh, I'm a little bit ahead of you, Laura. I'm sending my final draft off on probably Wednesday. So
do you find I hate you? Because I think it's really typical of writers to kind of in their heart hate every other writer when they finish, because it's the best day, right? It's the single best day of I mean, for me, it's like the single best day out of every 12 to 16 months. I think you write faster than I do. But that day you send it off is the best day. And then you don't get that day for a I mean, it's a really weird thing we do to ourselves. There's a kind of masochistic element.
But you kind of get it several times, because you send off the first draft and you say, yay, knowing that it's going to come back and you got to work. But yay, it's sent off as first draft, stamped up. Off it goes, and it comes back, and you get to work, and then you improve it, and you're improving it, and you send it off, and you say yay, and it's coming back, but okay, but it's each time it gets, and then at the end of it you say yes, off it goes, knowing that this is going to come by. The copy editor is going to argue with you about your commas, and this person is going to need you to look up this, and this person is going to say in India they didn't have that in 1830, and so you do that. All this crap is going to come back on you, and then but you'll finish that, and then you'll send it off, and you'll go yay, and then you'll get the proof pages. And at that point, I don't know about you, but I always read it aloud then, because there's that horrible echoes that show up. But I wait until I get the proof pages, because I change so much along the way that there's no point in doing the read aloud until it's set. And so I do the read aloud, and there's tweaks and changes and twidges, and then I send it off, and yay! So I get like 6 yays. And then
each yay is a little smaller. Like, to me, the big yay is the first like off, and then it's like a little, and oh my gosh, reading aloud is so crucial. I actually read aloud at 2 stages. I read aloud during the copy edit and the proofs, because I find that reading aloud is the single best thing to find continuity errors. Like, or to find that word that you're using too often. When you read aloud, you are engaged with your manuscript at a level that it's just impossible to do that without reading aloud. So I'm a huge fan of it.
Yeah.
And I really recommend it.
Full voice, not no. Full voice.
No.
And you can only do like 6 pages a day. Otherwise,
yes, no, it's exhausting.
Yeah.
I think I might be able to do almost 10 a day. And it was, when I started doing this, I felt like I was being a big diva, but I was sort of like, I've been doing this a long time, so get out of my way. I'm going to be a big diva. This is my moment. It makes the book better. I'm not doing this out of some weird emotional need that I have. I'm doing this because I know it makes my book better. But yeah.
And I think especially now that so many people are listening to audiobooks, that, I mean, when you say it yourself, you catch all the, the speech tags that you really need. He said, she said, he said, she said. No, you can, you just take them out. So anyway, somebody says they love Cad Dad. Somebody else says, I love that you write unlikable characters. Do you try to give them some redeemable qualities? Most of your characters are, they're all nice characters, but they're
human.
But they just have these odd things that you think, really? Oh, no, don't go there. Please don't go there.
I think what I'm really interested in is how do people that are kind of recognizable, like this could be my neighbor, this could be a guy in my PTA, et cetera, how do they end up doing something so transgressive? And that to me is far more interesting than the capital V villain who's just evil to be evil. And I read and enjoy a lot of books that are about just big evil people. They're fun. But when I write, again and again, I return to this idea of, okay, how does someone who's just like a guy I know end up being horrible? And that's why my books, I think my books are pretty consistently what is called a slow burn. Things don't happen fast or right away. It's about, how did you get from there to there? How did you get from being, a relatively decent person to a person who would consider hurting or killing another person?
Mm-hmm. Somebody says, not a question, a compliment. I admire your ability to write dialogue. I can hear the characters in my head. I didn't really like the main characters, but I did feel like I knew them, and they were totally believable. So yeah.
Yay! Thank you.
Yeah. When at what point do you find that you need to fine tune the dialogue of your characters, or do they fall naturally into their speech patterns without working?
I think the reading aloud part is really good on that. I think really good dialogue is hard to write. And I think the dialogue in a novel is not that much like a dialogue in a screenplay. I've not written any screenplays, but it was really interesting to me because I've been listening to a podcast by Bret Easton Ellison, And he was interviewing, it's an older one where he was interviewing the writer Jay McInerney, and they were talking about an adaptation of McInerney's books. And he was like, oh, there was this TV adaptation and it failed, and I don't understand it because they should have just lifted my dialogue from the page. And I was like, no, what makes good dialogue in a novel is nothing like what makes good dialogue in a film or television show. On the page, your characters can talk for a lot longer and it will feel natural. And if you lifted that dialogue, and I've seen this, my hero, James Cain, wrote amazing dialogue for the page, but it didn't work that well on screen. It really needed some massaging. And actually, Raymond Chandler was the person who figured that out. Raymond Chandler adapted Double Indemnity, and he wrote Cain, and he was like, your dialogue's great on the page, but it's not great on the screen. And you look at it and it's short and it's punchy and it looks like it should work. So I'm really attuned to how does dialogue work on the page? Like, does it, and it's different. And I work really hard on it. And yet at the same time, I know that if my dialogue were lifted in pieces and put into a film or television script, it wouldn't work at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Meredith Phillips asks, did your editor have any reservations about a book set during COVID that they think readers would not want to be reminded?
What's funny is that no one ever brought that note up to me, and I would have totally been sympathetic to it. Like if someone had said to me, can't this just be set in kind of some amorphous time? But it's kind of key because it's actually against the backdrop of this kind of weird timeout that all of these characters become more plausibly deranged. These are the things that I got notes about. These are where my editor and other people at my publishing house pushed back. They hated my depiction of a rich lady book club. Sorry. They were like, oh, can we just get rid of this scene? And I'm like, no, this is what, it's what it's like, because I've been to rich lady book clubs as a guest. And I will even tell you that when I was teaching last January at a workshop in Florida, where I've been teaching since 2006, I read that scene as my reading, and like Andre Dubus III and Elizabeth Stroud and Anne Hood, they were like, that's exactly what a book club is like. And I think they were just really worried that I was actually insulting my readers. I'm like, no, everybody's in a book club where they know there's someone who doesn't read the book, there's someone who watches the movie, there's someone who drinks too much, there's someone who's really worried about political correctness. So they pushed back on that. I think there was some nervousness about having a scene that took place on Election Day 2020. I think that there was a little like, do we really need to check in with these characters on Election Day 2020? And I think they were nervous about the scene when we check in with the characters 2 days after the attack on the Capitol. Mm. And I mean, look, my politics are easily discerned, but I'm not writing about my politics. I'm not advancing any political agenda in this book. I'm like, these are these people, these are their politics, this is how they're behaving. No judgment.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's sort of like, the attack on the Capitol was this sort of natural disaster that happened that would be, it's like a giant earthquake or a huge storm or something. It's just, you can't sort of ignore it, but yes. Yeah.
But I can 2 days later, you're talking about it.
Yeah, I can see why. Yes, a lot of people hesitate to write things like that. I took the sort of cheap route for the last book that I did, and I kind of vaguely made it after COVID, and sort of you talked about the effects of it. So you have this country house that depends on having people come and see the garden, and so their books are are very much not doing very well financially because
I
nobody
think that's a
can help
cheap
it.
way out. I just, my friend Megan Abbott wrote a beautiful book called Beware the Woman. And it's just not, there's like no COVID at all, but it feels incredibly timely.
Yeah.
And we were having a discussion, and she said, my books are never set in real time. My books are always set in this alternate universe that you don't really know when it is. And I'm like, oh, that totally makes sense, and it works.
Yeah, I think, for certain kinds of plots, it's really necessary, and I'm glad to see those kinds of plots, but I have yet to have to write one. So, why did you decide to make Meredith a plastic surgeon?
Okay, so Meredith, who is the wife of Joe, and who is someone who has all known almost from the time they began dating as college students, all of his secrets. Meredith actually believes herself to be a godlike creature. And this is a through line in the book. And she claims to be an atheist. And she, even within her own head, within her own mind, will demur, oh, I'm not improving upon God's work because I don't think I'm a God. However, if you believe in God, this child who needs their cleft palate fixed, this is what God made, and now I'm going to make it better. So what does that make me? If I improve upon the work of God, what am I? I'm crazy about the work of Madeline Miller. I just love it so much. And so that was very much in my mind. And like, they're just like tiny things from the first time we see Meredith at the end of the chapter, she gets into bed with her husband, and she's aware that her feet are grotesque because she's a runner, and they're just they're just gross and rough, and her toenails are bad, and she angles her feet away so they won't brush her husband in the night. And in that moment, and this is like the kind of stuff you think about, and I don't expect readers to think about it, but it's like, I was thinking about Cupid and Psyche. Not Cupid and Psyche, is it Cupid and Psyche, when Psyche thinks she's married to a monster who comes into her bed every night. So Meredith is like, oh, I'm gonna like ankle my feet away so that my ugly monstrous feet will not touch my beautiful, perfect husband. Yeah, so that's part of it. And Meredith does do good work. She does help people. She does do mercy missions to Guatemala. She works on the faces and, Adam's apples of trans women. She's in so many ways a really exemplary person. And in so many ways, she's not. And again, because she has that really incredibly judgmental, caustic voice in her head. And because on some level, she thinks she's a goddess. And that's dangerous to think that way.
The other two main characters in there, Amber runs a gallery of what I think of as outsider art. I don't know if you use that term in the book.
I think I do use the term outsider art in the book. And it's really interesting because in one of like the most bizarre coincidences in the world, like a month after I turned the book in, I was accepted into the docent program at the American Visionary Art Museum in Baltimore. And I've spent the past year training. I gave a tour today. It was pretty fantastic. And like the piece behind me is like a Chris Roberts Antio piece. So I love visionary art, outsider art. A visionary has kind of taken over. And now there's even an attempt to talk more about calling it intuitive art. The idea is that it's untrained artist. And I'm crazy about it. I love it. It is one of my passions. And so it made sense to me that Amber would be drawn to the art of untrained people, especially if they had produced that art in prison. And that's a thing. And, it's just something I love, and I wanted to bring it into the text.
And I thought it was an interesting balance with poor old Joe, who is the gung-ho real estate guy who's caught in the middle of, I mean, he's the one who, although Meredith is immunocompromised and therefore very vulnerable physically, it's Joe who's got COVID coming down on his head. I love the way that Amber, you think that of any place, an art gallery would be something that people would not support during COVID. But in fact, I mean, why not spend your money on somebody's art? Because why not? But
People
no one
got
wants to do shopping malls. And here's Joe, who's committed everything to the shopping mall. And
that was just an actual thing, is that some galleries actually did really well during COVID because people got sick of looking what was on their walls and people were doing all this sprucing up. And I mean, I was someone who bought a piece from a gallery in Florida in the middle of COVID. And the young woman who sold, I was like, I can afford the piece. I couldn't afford the shipping. I think the shipping costs more than the piece. It was crazy. And I remember, and I thank her in the acknowledgements because she then later kind of walked me through what's your job and how do you do it? And yeah, so that was something that was very true. I did a lot of research into commercial real estate, which I found fascinating. And I really had fun creating like my Class C shopping center, which is like the smallest shopping center with like a little strip center. And I knew which businesses were going bankrupt and kind of knew I had old friends from my newspaper days who helped me with that. A lovely woman I met on Twitter who helped me kind of figure out all of Joe's financial in and outs.
and how each of their jobs sort of both interacts and defines them as people. So yes. Let's see, we're getting down to our last 5 or 6 minutes here. Why don't you tell me first what you're working on next? What have you got in the pipeline, Laura?
Having spent the course of this book with 3 of the most unpleasant people in the world, I needed to hang out with someone nice. I really did. And there was a minor character from the series I wrote, which I hope to return to one day, the Tess Monahan series. There's a minor character who's a woman, an older woman. By an older woman, I mean a woman who's, basically my age, maybe 4 years older than I am, I figured out. But a woman who's lived a very sheltered, quiet life, but now she's come into a bit of money. And all she wants to do is go to Paris and take a Seine River cruise with her best friend from girlhood. And she finds herself caught up in this kind of, I keep describing it as Charade, the wonderful film, crossed with From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil Frankweiler. There's this very sweet widow. She's trying to take a Seine River cruise. And somehow everyone's under the impression that she's come into the possession of a Pakistani antiquity, a sculpture of a phoenix-like bird. And she keeps saying to everyone, I really think I would know if there's a statue in my suitcase. I don't, but she's on the cruise. Things keep happening. There's a gorgeous young man whose identity changes like about every 30 pages. He's like, oh, did I say I was this? I'm really that. And it's been such a pleasure to write. And the first line of the book is, her name is Mrs. Blossom. It's like Mrs. Blossom had never been upgraded in her life. And that's just, so, and what was even better is that I was like, I'm a novelist, we make stuff up. At a certain point, I should be able to do this through my imagination and sitting at my dining room table. On May 10th, I think I literally threw down a pen and said, I can't do this without taking the cruise. And I immediately booked my kid and me on the cruise that I was using as like my prototype. And we spent 10 days in June in Paris and on a river cruise. And we went to Monet's gardens, and we went to Richard the Lionheart's castle. We went to Rouen. We saw, and it's like, and all of that has come into the book, and I'm really happy we did it. And it has been so much fun writing about a nice person. I've loved it.
Mrs. Eris goes to Paris and meets criminals.
It is. I think it is kind of in that vein. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Does it have a working title?
Oh yeah, I call it Objects of Desire. That's my working title.
There you go. So now I would highly recommend that any of you who do not have a copy of Prom Mom in your hot little hands, get one. You can either get one from your library, because we are with the libraries, or if you would like a signed copy, Laura, your local bookstore that you can get it to and sign a copy and we'll ship. Can you?
I'm going to name two. One is the Ivy and the other is Greedy Reads. Baltimore is really
Ivy?
The Ivy,
Mm-hmm.
IVY, and the other is Greedy Reads. And they're both wonderful local bookstores in Baltimore. And I mean, I remember a time not long ago when Baltimore had barely any independent bookstores, and now there's been this amazing renaissance. It's so cool.
Greedy Reads in Baltimore. There we go. Okay, super. So I hope that we have answered everybody's questions. I hope that we have answered most of my questions. And did we have anything that I was supposed to read here? Thank you, Laura, for the wonderful conversation. It says that right there. So that this was written assuming that you and I would have a wonderful conversation. I wonder what about that. And thank you, everyone who joined us tonight. And thank you for the ladies who ran this. Thank you to the San Mateo County Libraries. You should also, if you are listening to this, not necessarily Laura, but everyone else, check out the San Mateo County Libraries upcoming author talks at SMCL, that's San Mateo County Libraries, smcl.org/author talks. And we would appreciate it if you could tell us how SMCL and Laura and Laurie did with this program at smcl.org/rate this event. So, and as I said, if you'd like a copy of Prom Mom, it's available at any of your local bookstores. If you don't need it signed, pick it up. You can order it through bookshop.org, which is an excellent organization. And I look forward to seeing the new one set in Paris. I think that's really great fun. And thank you very much, Laura, and have a good night, and everyone happy reading. So
thank you, Laurie, for doing this. I'm so honored that you did this. It's
always
amazing.
A pleasure.
Always. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.